Audrey Selwyn stepped into the extravagant private club with all the apprehension of someone walking a tightrope high above a chasm. Her heart pounded, and a thin sheen of perspiration marked her palms, despite the otherwise cool interior. She could hardly believe she was there by choice. Yet, what alternative did she truly have? Piles of overdue bills weighed on her conscience, her father's medical treatments demanded more money than she could ever earn at her modest marketing job, and her younger brother's tuition hung in the balance. In short, desperation had driven her to a place she never imagined herself entering, a clandestine auction for contracts that bound young women to wealthy men. She had heard of it in whispers from a distant acquaintance who knew people on the fringes of elite society. Rumor had it that these contracts varied in length, from a few weeks to a full year, with terms that might include anything from attending social events to posing as a fiancé in order to bolster a businessman's public image. Some arrangements, Audrey had heard, went further, but every clause was negotiated. It was a transaction as cold and calculated as any business deal. As she walked through the marble-floored corridor, plush carpets muffling her steps, she felt her stomach twist in knots. She had vowed never to sell her dignity, but after countless rejections for financial aid and the foreclosure notice lurking in her mailbox, she was left with few options. The main hall of the club was grand, with gilded columns and velvet drapes framing a stage at one end. A discreet staff guided her to a waiting area where other women sat, wearing various expressions of unease and resignation. Audrey felt a pang of empathy for them, knowing that each must have her own story of hardship. She tried to still her trembling hands, reminding herself that this was only a last resort, a plan to buy her father's well-being in her brother's future. Once her debts were cleared and her father's treatments were paid for, she could leave this world behind. When her turn came, the lights felt glaringly bright, forcing her to blink as she walked onto the stage. Even in her simple navy dress, she felt overexposed. A few men in tailored suits sat in the front row, watching with dispassionate eyes. One of them looked bored, drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair. Another skimmed through documents, barely bothering to glance up. Audrey felt her heart thunder in her chest, half hoping that none of them would bother making a bid for her. She had convinced herself that if no one offered, she could at least claim she tried. And then he walked in. It was as though the atmosphere shifted the moment Salem Blackwood set foot in the hall. Tall, with shoulders that seemed carved from stone and a gaze that could freeze lesser men in their tracks, he cut a formidable figure in his dark suit. He moved with assured purpose, scanning the stage until his eyes landed on Audrey. She couldn't read his thoughts, but she felt a jolt, as though a live wire had connected them for an instant. A hush fell over the room, and the other men seemed to slide back in their seats, conceding the floor to him without question. Salem Blackwood's reputation preceded him, a ruthless billionaire known for his game-changing takeovers and an iron will that seldom bent to anyone else's demands. Audrey's heart hammered faster. She recalled the rumors. They said Salem had never lost a negotiation, that he always came away with precisely what he wanted. She swallowed hard, guessing that she was about to find out exactly what that meant. He lifted a hand toward the auctioneer, who was momentarily caught off guard by the abruptness of this new arrival. A quiet flurry of whispered conversations erupted among staff and participants, but it died down just as suddenly as it began. Salem Blackwood made a single, simple gesture, and the auctioneer nodded respectfully, as if receiving a silent command. The sum he offered for Audrey's contract was whispered at first, but then the number was repeated more loudly, sending murmurs through the small crowd. It dwarfed any previous bids that evening. Audrey's breath seized in her lungs, and she almost swayed on her feet. She had hoped for a reasonable amount to pay off her father's urgent bills, yet the figure Salem named threatened to overshadow all her debts in one stroke. The other men who had briefly considered bidding on her fell silent, some shooting glances at Salem, as though to confirm they dared not compete against him. Audrey felt as though the rest of the proceedings were moving in slow motion. A gavel struck. Applause broke out in a few corners of the hall, more out of obligatory custom than genuine enthusiasm, and a polite attendant escorted her off stage. She was led through another corridor and into a private lounge where she was offered water. Someone pushed papers before her to confirm the transaction. Her hand trembled as she signed the meticulously printed contract, scanning over the key points. She would be required to live in Salem's residence for 6 months, attend the events he deemed necessary, and uphold confidentiality at all costs. In exchange, every debt she carried would be erased. Her father's medical treatments would be paid for in full, and her brother's tuition guaranteed. It sounded too good to be real, except that she knew the hidden cost. Her freedom, for a time, was no longer her own. Before she could fully process what she had done, a discreet voice at her shoulder announced that Mr. Blackwood would see her now. She felt her pulse spike again. The lounge's doors swung open, and there he stood, every bit as imposing up close. His dark eyes were inscrutable, and his posture revealed neither warmth nor hostility. It struck Audrey as a business transaction in his mind, no more and no less. Yet she thought she detected a flicker of tension around his mouth, as if this arrangement involved more than mere cold calculation. He offered a curt nod, introducing himself simply as Salem. His voice was low and steady, the kind that didn't need to be loud to command attention. Audrey managed to return a tentative greeting, stumbling over her own name, despite the fact that he surely knew everything about her by this point. He informed her that a car would take her to his penthouse, where she would stay until further instructions. Then, with a distant sort of courtesy, he told her she could settle in that evening, and that he would provide more details about her new role in the morning. As Audrey followed the staff member down the corridor, she could hardly breathe. The knowledge that she had just sold herself for 6 months in the care of this enigmatic billionaire filled her with a strange mix of dread and relief. She had secured the money to save her family from ruin, but what lay ahead in this gilded cage of opulence and power, she could only guess. Somewhere behind her, she imagined Salem Blackwood stepping out of the lounge with the same composed air he had displayed in the auction hall, carrying no visible trace of emotion. Later that night, as she settled into an opulent bedroom high above the city, she stared out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the maze of lights below. She reminded herself that she had done this for her father, for her brother, out of responsibility and desperation. Yet she couldn't quiet the small voice inside that asked how she would endure living with a man whose entire presence radiated control, and what might happen if she discovered a side of him neither he nor she was prepared to face. Her hand clenched the sheets, and her pulse fluttered in her throat. Sleep refused to come easily in this new world she had entered, bound to a stranger by the signature on a contract. The next morning, Audrey awoke to the quiet hum of the penthouse's climate control system and the pale light of dawn creeping through sheer curtains that framed a panoramic view of the city skyline. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The sumptuous surroundings, fine linens, a plush rug, and the impossibly high ceilings, momentarily tricked her into thinking she was in a luxury hotel. But the previous night's events came rushing back with a pang of mingled anxiety and resignation: the clandestine auction, the breathtaking sum Salem Blackwood had paid, and her own shaky signature on the contract that bound her to him for 6 months. She sat up slowly, her thoughts swimming. Unsure of what would be expected of her, she glanced at a digital clock on the bedside table, noting it was still early. A discreet knock on the door startled her, and she realized that private life might no longer be truly private in this world of quiet opulence. A polite voice from the other side inquired if she was ready for breakfast. Feeling awkward, Audrey opened the door to find a well-dressed housekeeper named Lane, who offered a gentle smile and a carefully folded set of clothes, presumably for the day's activities. Audrey thanked her, trying not to show how out of place she felt. Lane guided her to a gleaming bathroom with polished marble floors and a rainfall shower. After freshening up, Audrey dressed in the simple yet elegant outfit left for her, a soft blouse and tailored pants that fit almost too perfectly. She wondered how they knew her measurements so precisely, then reminded herself that someone with Salem Blackwood's resources would have no trouble discovering every personal detail he wanted. Upon returning to the bedroom, she found a note: "Meet me in the main salon at 9. S.B." The initials sent a flutter through her chest. She recalled his inscrutable gaze, the clipped way he spoke, and the way the entire auction hall had fallen silent when he made his bid. She couldn't help feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity at the idea of seeing him again outside of that tense setting. Shortly before the appointed hour, Audrey ventured out into the penthouse's main corridor. The walls were lined with modern art, abstract paintings in muted tones, each illuminated by subtle track lighting. Expansive windows revealed a cityscape that stretched as far as the horizon. Everything spoke of unimaginable wealth, from the sleek furniture to the hush that seemed to settle over every surface. Eventually, she reached a set of double doors that stood partially open, revealing what looked like a grand living area overlooking a wraparound terrace. She stepped inside, feeling dwarfed by the high ceilings and the imposing presence of massive windows. Polished wood floors led to a seating arrangement where Salem waited, dressed in a dark blazer, sipping what appeared to be coffee. His attention was fixed on a tablet in his hands, brow furrowed in concentration. A moment later, he set the device down and stood to greet her. "Good morning," he said, his tone as measured as the day before. He offered a slight inclination of his head, something between a polite bow and a businessman's nod. "I trust you slept well." Audrey managed a small, careful smile. "I did, thank you," she replied, though her night had been anything but restful. She remained standing, uncertain of the protocol here. Should she sit, wait for him to offer a seat, or simply stand until told otherwise? Salem gestured toward one of the chairs across from him. "Please," he said, "make yourself comfortable." She lowered herself onto the plush cushions, recalling the lines of the contract that had spelled out certain rules. She was to appear whenever he summoned her, to keep all matters confidential, and to follow a schedule he deemed appropriate. Yet there had been no explicit mention of how these interactions would feel on a personal level. In her mind, she had pictured something more transactional, her presence required for public events, perhaps minimal contact otherwise. The intimacy of being alone with him here, in the early morning quiet, felt strangely disorienting. He watched her for a moment with that same assessing gaze he'd shown in the auction hall, and she had the unnerving sensation of being evaluated. Then he cleared his throat. "I think we should discuss a few details regarding your role." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap to steady them. "Of course." He leaned back in his chair, letting his gaze drift momentarily to the skyline before meeting her eyes again. "I know the contract is unusual," he began. "You are here, in part, to accompany me to certain corporate gatherings and charitable events. There may also be occasions where I will need you to act as a companion when I entertain business associates. Public image is a significant factor in my world, and certain expectations come with being at my side." Audrey's heart sank a little. She thought of how she'd prided herself on building a modest but respectable career in marketing before her family's financial disaster. Now it seemed her job would revolve around playing a role she wasn't sure she wanted. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll do my best to meet those expectations." Salem gave a faint nod. For a fleeting moment, a shadow passed over his expression, as though he found the whole arrangement distasteful in some way. Or perhaps Audrey was imagining it. He returned to his neutral demeanor too quickly to be certain. "I have someone on staff, my assistant, who will help coordinate your schedule and attire for each event," he continued. "We'll discuss specifics as they arise. In the meantime, you are free to settle in and make yourself at home." She couldn't help a brief, ironic smile at the phrase, "make yourself at home." It was difficult to imagine any sense of normalcy here, in a penthouse that felt more like a museum exhibit of extravagance. Still, she appreciated that he was attempting civility. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze. Well, I appreciate what you've done for my family's debts." At that, something flickered in his dark eyes. Maybe it was a hint of empathy or a vestige of guilt, she couldn't tell. I had the means, he said simply, as if that explained everything. Then he gestured to a small table where a covered tray stood waiting. Would you like something to eat? Before Audrey could answer, Lane appeared, silently arranging a light breakfast of fresh fruit, toast, and coffee. Salem took a sip of his own drink and set it aside. I have to leave for a meeting soon, he said, checking his watch. But my assistant, Noah, will be here to go over the details of your schedule for the next few days. There's a charity gala tomorrow evening, one of those events where my presence is mandatory. You'll be attending with me. Her stomach tightened. A public event so soon? She'd barely gotten her bearings. Still, she forced a nod. All right. Salem stood, and she rose as well out of courtesy. For an instant, they stood face to face, closer than they had been the night before. She couldn't ignore the commanding aura he seemed to carry effortlessly, nor could she ignore the curiosity that gnawed at her. What drove a man like Salem Blackwood to purchase companionship in such a manner? He hardly seemed lacking in charisma or resources to attract a partner. But it wasn't her place to question him, at least not yet. He hesitated as if weighing whether to say more, then offered a formal goodbye. If you need anything, Lane can assist you. I'll see you this evening. And just like that, he exited the room with an unhurried stride, leaving Audrey in the quiet hush of a space that somehow felt emptier the moment he was gone. She sank back into the chair, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her eyes roamed over the untouched breakfast, the impeccable furnishings, and the thick cityscape beyond the windows. This was her new reality, a contract that promised both salvation from debt and a life spent in the orbit of an enigmatic billionaire. She told herself it was only for 6 months, that she could endure anything if it meant protecting her father and brother. Yet the knot in her stomach refused to unravel. For a time, she nibbled on a piece of toast, trying to quell her nerves. Then she told herself she should explore the penthouse, familiarize herself with her temporary home. No one stopped her as she wandered through sprawling hallways lined with art and sculptures, passing doors that presumably led to guest suites, a private study, and who knew what else. The sheer scale of Salem's residence made her feel tiny, adrift in corridors designed for lavish gatherings and high-profile deals. Eventually, she stumbled upon a small reading room, walls lined with leather-bound books, complete with a comforting armchair in the corner. Sinking into its cushioned seat, she realized this might be the most inviting space she'd seen so far, a retreat from the imposing veneer everywhere else. Shelves offered works on business strategy, biographies of financial magnates, even some titles on classical literature. The room held an unexpected warmth, and Audrey wondered if Salem himself ever lingered here. Perhaps he'd sit late at night, reading or thinking, away from the demands of his empire. She shivered, recalling the faint flicker of vulnerability she'd caught in his eyes that morning. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the aloof, commanding presence that came so naturally to him. But maybe he wasn't as unaffected by this arrangement as he seemed. The thought gave her a small spark of comfort, or at least curiosity. By late afternoon, she'd circled back to her own quarters, exhausted from the emotional and mental strain of trying to absorb this new life. She rested on the edge of the bed, mind churning with questions. What would tomorrow's charity gala demand of her? Would she be paraded around like an accessory, or introduced more discreetly? How would she face the eyes of the city's elite, knowing she was here by virtue of a private contract? She had no illusions about the gossip that might swirl if anyone discovered the truth. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. A young man with sharp features and bright eyes peeked in. "Miss Selwyn?" he asked, stepping into the room with polite caution. "I'm Noah Ellington, Mr. Blackwood's personal assistant. He asked me to go over the details for tomorrow's event." Audrey stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her trousers, reminding herself that these people were her new colleagues, or overseers, depending on how she looked at it. Still, she forced herself to be cordial. "Of course. Nice to meet you." They moved to a small sitting area where Noah produced a sleek tablet. He showed her a schedule that included a fitting for a formal gown, a hair and makeup appointment, and then a briefing on the nature of the charity's cause. Mr. Blackwood prefers to be well prepared for these galas. He expects you to be familiar with the event's purpose, the key donors, and any relevant talking points, Noah explained. It's a significant PR opportunity for Blackwood International, and naturally, a lot of cameras and journalists will be present. Audrey swallowed hard, her earlier apprehension returning full force. She felt her throat tighten. I see. Will I be introduced? Or am I just supposed to be in the background? Noah hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Blackwood generally keeps his personal life very private. But your presence at his side won't go unnoticed. The two of you may be photographed together, and people will wonder. For now, you're simply his guest, but there might be rumors or speculation if the media picks up on it. She fought the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. If only the photographers and gossip columnists knew the real story behind her sudden appearance in this exclusive circle. But that was precisely what the contract forbade, revealing the truth. She forced a measured nod and tried to appear unruffled. I'll handle it, she said. Whatever is required. Noah offered a sympathetic smile, as though sensing her unease. We've arranged for a stylist to come by this evening to fit you for an appropriate gown. Don't worry too much, just focus on carrying yourself with poise. Mr. Blackwood has a way of minimizing unwanted attention. They spent another half-hour discussing names of key attendees, the charity's mission, and a tentative timeline for the next day. When Noah left, Audrey felt as though she'd been given a crash course in high society etiquette and public relations, layering on top of the uneasy knowledge that she was little more than a purchased companion in the eyes of the man who now controlled her fate. As twilight deepened outside the penthouse windows, she stood by the glass, gazing at the myriad lights of the city. Somewhere out there was her old life, struggling to make ends meet, worrying about her father, her brother. That world felt both distant and painfully close, a reminder of why she'd agreed to this in the first place. She thought of Salem's brisk command and the way he exuded power with every measured step. Did he truly expect her to blend seamlessly into this sphere of influence, or was he testing her to see if she would crack under pressure? She brushed aside the questions for now, knowing that no amount of mental circling would solve them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and she would rise to meet them. After all, she had a debt to repay, one measured not just in currency, but in pride, loyalty, and the hope of eventually returning to a life of her own making. In the hush of the penthouse, with the distant hum of the city below, Audrey made a quiet promise to herself: she would endure these 6 months with dignity, however tense and complicated they might become. But as she turned away from the window, she couldn't stop the flicker of uncertainty that rose in her chest, a small voice whispering that this arrangement could lead her down paths she could never have predicted, and perhaps show her sides of Salem Blackwood she was not at all prepared to see. The rest of that day passed in a blur of preparations. True to Noah's word, a stylist arrived in the early evening, a poised and precise woman named Beatrix. She swept into the penthouse like a whirlwind, arms loaded with garment bags, makeup kits, and a discerning eye that took Audrey's measure with one sweeping glance. Within minutes, the living room was transformed into an impromptu dressing suite, complete with mirrors hauled in by 2 silent assistants and a rolling rack of shimmering gowns that caught the light in every possible hue. Audrey found the whole process surreal. Beatrix spoke in clipped, professional tones as she and her team nudged Audrey this way and that, testing various fabrics against her skin tone and muttering about cuts, silhouettes, and whether to emphasize or downplay certain features. Although Audrey was petite, with a slender frame, the stylist insisted on highlighting her natural curves in a dress that draped elegantly over her hips but fell in soft lines to the floor. By the time they settled on an emerald green gown with a modest yet flattering neckline, Audrey could scarcely recognize herself. Beatrix's deft hands pinned her hair into a smooth chignon, leaving a few wisps to frame her face. Subtle, smoky eye makeup and a touch of gloss brought out the green specks in her hazel eyes. All this attention made her feel like a living mannequin, until she glanced at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time since she'd signed the contract, she felt an inkling of confidence. The dress was exquisite, hugging her in all the right places without feeling overly revealing. A faint blush colored her cheeks at the realization that she no longer resembled the quietly desperate woman who had stepped on stage at that auction. Even so, she couldn't forget how she'd ended up here. The gown's price tag alone likely eclipsed her family's monthly expenses by a wide margin. Beatrix and her assistants packed up their gear, leaving Audrey with final instructions: be ready by 7 sharp the following evening, hair and makeup retouched, gown steamed of any creases. She swallowed hard as they left, already anticipating the swirl of cameras and socialites that awaited her. She was no stranger to gatherings. Her old marketing firm had hosted the occasional conference, but this was on a scale, and in a realm, she'd never experienced before. Anxiously, she wondered if her nerves would betray her. After the whirlwind fitting, the penthouse grew quiet again. Hunger reminded her she'd eaten little that day, so she made her way to the sleek, modern kitchen. She half expected to find it empty, but Lane was there, placing covered dishes in the refrigerator. Lane flashed a sympathetic smile, as if sensing Audrey's unsettled state. "Would you like something for dinner?" Lane asked gently. "Mr. Blackwood left instructions that you could have anything prepared you wish." Audrey hesitated, feeling a twinge of awkwardness at the idea of commanding a personal chef. Still, her stomach rumbled in protest, and practicality won out. "Something light, maybe a salad and some fruit," she requested, not wanting to make a fuss. Lane nodded and disappeared into the adjacent pantry. Left to wait, Audrey perched at the marble countertop and let her gaze drift to the city lights beyond the windows. Salem still hadn't returned. She'd heard from Noah that his meeting sometimes stretched late into the night, so she wasn't entirely surprised. Yet she caught herself listening for footsteps or doors, wondering if he would stride in and demand an update on her progress with the stylist. The contract spelled out her role in clear, almost clinical terms, but the power imbalance left her uneasy. She was prepared to fulfill her part, but she couldn't help bracing for some attempt on his part to exert control over every facet of her life. Strangely, though, the most controlling presence so far had been the constant staff supervision. Salem himself remained elusive. Dinner arrived in the form of a beautifully plated salad dotted with roasted vegetables and goat cheese, accompanied by a bowl of diced melon that tasted sweeter than anything Audrey had eaten in recent memory. Simple though it was, she found it oddly comforting. She finished every bite, determined to keep her strength up for whatever awaited her the next day. After she returned to her suite, she tried reading a marketing journal to steady her mind, but her thoughts kept drifting to the man who had brought her here and what it would be like to stand at his side under a barrage of curious gazes. Sleep was fitful that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she imagined walking into a grand ballroom filled with strangers. In one version of her dream, Salem abandoned her at the threshold, leaving her alone to fend off the crowd's prying questions. In another, he walked beside her but kept his hand clasped around her wrist in an unyielding grip. Neither scenario brought her any comfort. She awoke before dawn, heart racing, tangles of her hair damp from sweat. It took a moment to reassure herself she was safe in the penthouse, not lost in some labyrinth of social scrutiny. The day of the gala arrived too quickly. Morning turned to afternoon as Noah guided her through a final briefing. He explained the charity's mission, providing educational support for underprivileged youth, and rattled off the names of several influential donors who would be present. With each sentence, he stressed the importance of first impressions. Audrey absorbed all of it, scribbling mental notes while struggling to keep her mounting anxiety at bay. By the time evening rolled around, Lane and another stylist, an energetic young man who introduced himself as Harlan, helped her dress and redo her hair. The emerald gown fit as perfectly as before, only now she felt the full weight of the event's significance pressing on her shoulders. Harlan pinned a delicate bracelet to her wrist and added a matching set of earrings, whispering words of encouragement that she looked absolutely divine. His cheerful tone almost convinced her she was stepping onto a movie set rather than into real life. Shortly before 7, a soft knock on her bedroom door announced Salem's arrival. Her pulse fluttered as she called for him to enter. She'd been expecting either Noah or someone else from the staff, but seeing Salem in the doorway, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, momentarily stole the air from her lungs. He looked every inch the commanding CEO, from the crisp lines of his jacket to the quiet confidence in his eyes. Though he remained outwardly composed, she thought she glimpsed a fleeting spark in his gaze as it moved over her gown. "You're ready," he said, more a statement than a question. Yet his tone held an undertone of approval she hadn't anticipated. "Yes," she replied, smoothing the skirt of her dress to hide the trembling in her hands. "Noah filled me in on all the details." Salem inclined his head in acknowledgement. "The car is waiting downstairs. We should go, there's a reception before the main ceremony." She followed him through the penthouse and into the private elevator that whisked them directly to the ground floor parking area. In silence, they stepped into the back of a sleek black town car. She caught a hint of his cologne, clean, understated, with a faint spicy note. The scent reminded her of distant, exotic places, reinforcing how different his world was from hers. Though they sat barely a foot apart, the gulf of social standing, power, and pretense felt massive. "Are you nervous?" he asked abruptly once the car moved into the flow of evening traffic. Audrey blinked, not expecting the question. There was a trace of concern in his voice. Perhaps it was just the natural politeness of a host ensuring his guest didn't panic before an event. Still, she chose honesty. "A bit. It's not every day I attend a gala of this caliber." He didn't respond immediately. Outside, the city flashed by in a blur of neon signs and bustling sidewalks. At last, Salem spoke, his tone thoughtful. "These events are more predictable than they seem. People will ask superficial questions, how you've been, who you're wearing, nothing that really matters. Our objective is to show support for the charity, but also maintain a certain level of decorum. Just stay by my side, and you'll be fine." A ripple of relief passed through her, though she wondered if his reassurance came from genuine kindness or the need to protect his investment. "I understand," she said softly. "I appreciate the advice." The remainder of the drive was marked by an uneasy quiet, broken only by the gentle hum of the car's engine. She wished she could peer into his thoughts, see whether he felt any tension about bringing her as his companion. The contract had spelled out her role in abstract terms, but what would it actually look like in practice? She thought of the swirling cameras, the well-to-do philanthropists, the inevitable speculation from watchers curious about the woman at Salem Blackwood's elbow. When they arrived at the entrance to a grand hotel, cameras were already flashing. A throng of elegantly dressed attendees spilled onto a red carpet that led into a lavishly lit foyer. Salem's driver opened their door, and Audrey braced herself. Salem stepped out first, then offered his hand to help her exit. She placed her gloved fingers in his, grateful for the steadiness of his grip even as her heart threatened to pound out of her chest. The roar of voices, the clink of champagne glasses, and the bright bursts of photographers' bulbs struck her like a tidal wave. Salem kept her close to his side, guiding her up the short flight of steps. Though he wore a polite half-smile, she sensed a carefully controlled tension beneath it. He wasn't exactly in his element either, or perhaps he simply disliked the invasive press. A hotel staff member greeted them, ushering them into the reception area. The room shone with crystal chandeliers, and the click of expensive heels echoed on polished marble floors. Almost immediately, a few well-dressed individuals approached, all too eager to greet Salem and, by extension, acknowledge Audrey. She forced a polite smile, remembering to keep her posture poised. Noah's briefing floated through her mind: nod at the mention of certain donors, express interest in the cause, deflect any personal questions back to the charity. To her surprise, Salem introduced her with a certain quiet formality, referring to her simply as Ms. Selwyn and mentioning that she was here in support of the charitable mission. He didn't elaborate on their connection, nor did he frame her as a mere plus one. The subtlety calmed her nerves. While the curiosity in some people's eyes was unmistakable, who was this woman at Salem Blackwood's side, they largely accepted the introduction without pressing. She found herself thankful for Salem's unspoken cooperation in minimizing prying queries. Over the course of the evening, the two of them navigated clusters of guests, pausing here and there to exchange pleasantries or comment on the charity's upcoming projects. Audrey tried to project confidence, but the weight of so many eyes on her eventually took its toll. She felt a slight tremor in her hand when she placed her champagne flute back on a passing tray. Salem noticed and covered her hand briefly with his, a small gesture of reassurance that no one else seemed to catch. The warmth of his touch contrasted sharply with the cool persona he projected. As the night wore on, the formal speeches began, organizers thanked the major donors, and a short video showcased the charity's achievements in providing scholarships. Salem took his seat at a prominent table, and Audrey lowered herself into the chair beside him. The lights dimmed, and she exhaled quietly, relieved for a momentary break from the swirl of social demands. Her gaze drifted to Salem, whose expression was partially shadowed. He looked composed, almost statuesque, except for the faint tension around his jaw. When the final applause died down, the hosts opened the floor to dancing. Music filled the expansive ballroom, and Audrey tensed at the idea of weaving through a waltz or two-step under so many watchful gazes. But it wasn't long before a few couples drifted onto the dance floor, encouraging others to follow. Audrey noticed Salem's eyes flick briefly to the couples gliding across the polished marble, then back to her. In that moment, she silently prayed he wouldn't ask. The idea of being in his arms, under 100 curious stares, made her insides twist in knots. Yet she also recognized it might be part of the unspoken contract, appearances, illusions, the dance of social acceptance. If he requested her presence on the dance floor, she'd have to oblige. But to her surprise and mixed relief, Salem remained seated, focusing instead on the swirl of conversation at their table. Here and there, he offered a few words in response to guests who approached, but otherwise seemed content to observe. Every so often, his gaze drifted back to Audrey, as if silently assessing her. With the lights low and the music softly echoing, she found herself momentarily at ease, grateful he hadn't insisted on a public dance. Eventually, dessert was served, miniature confections so delicate they looked more like edible art than food. Audrey nibbled on a small chocolate creation while attempting casual conversation with the woman seated to her left, a minor socialite who seemed more interested in Salem's business conquests than in any philanthropic detail. Audrey answered politely when pressed, but gave no personal revelations. She had to guard the truth, mindful that any slip could lead to damaging rumors. Before the hour grew too late, Salem rose to signal their departure. He offered respectful goodbyes to a few key figures, thanked the organizers for the successful event, and placed a light hand on Audrey's lower back to guide her toward the exit. Cameras still flashed outside, though fewer reporters lingered at this advanced hour. Audrey breathed in the cool night air, grateful to escape the enclosed realm of power and scrutiny. The drive back to the penthouse was quiet, but less tense than before. Audrey found herself watching Salem's profile, illuminated by passing streetlights. She remembered the small moment of solace he'd given her when she was nervous, his hand over hers, a silent assurance. Perhaps he wasn't the emotionless tyrant she'd feared. The contract might define their roles, but beneath it, there seemed to be flickers of genuine concern, or at least courtesy, that she couldn't ignore. When they arrived, Salem walked her to the private elevator and waited as the doors slid open. A hush settled over them, a rare moment where no staff stood by, no onlookers peered in. She turned to him, uncertain how to express her gratitude for his restraint at the gala. Eventually, she settled on a simple, soft-spoken, "thank you." He studied her for a second, then gave a small nod. "You handled yourself well tonight," he murmured. "No need to thank me for that." Despite the brevity of his response, she caught a subtle warmth in his tone that lingered even as he stepped away. She entered the elevator alone, feeling the gentle lurch as it rose toward her suite. The hush of the empty corridor greeted her, and she walked to her bedroom with feet that ached from hours in high heels but a mind buzzing with thoughts. Standing before the large mirror, Audrey gently slipped off her earrings, then ran her fingers along the neckline of the emerald gown. The reflection she saw was still foreign, an elegantly poised figure who wore wealth like a borrowed costume. Yet beneath it all, she remained who she had always been, a woman trying to salvage her family's future through any means possible. Tonight, she'd survived a social crucible that had threatened to unravel her nerves. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but she felt a touch less fear. Maybe she could navigate this world after all, if she kept her heart guarded and her wits about her. She recalled Salem's words, and the almost imperceptible gentleness he'd shown. A small flicker of hope sprang up inside her, hope that these 6 months might not be solely about enduring a contract, but perhaps discovering an unforeseen kindness in a man renowned for his merciless business dealings. Clinging to that hopeful spark, she changed out of her gown, slipped under the blankets, and let the memory of the evening's music lull her into a restless but strangely optimistic sleep. Audrey awoke the next morning to a soft knock on her door and the faint glow of sunlight through the drawn curtains. She felt the lingering weariness from the gala, her feet still tender from the evening's high heels. Lane's gentle voice filtered into the room, informing her that breakfast would be ready in half an hour if she wished to dine in the kitchen. Audrey murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and pushed aside the covers, stretching until the muscles in her arms and back gave a satisfying release. Her mind wandered to the events of the previous night, sifting through the mingled sights and sounds of the gala. Though she had expected a swirl of gossip and scrutiny, most people had been polite if somewhat curious, leaving her to navigate the crowd with only moderate discomfort. What stuck with her most was Salem's behavior, his subtle steadiness, the way he introduced her with a simple yet respectful courtesy that shielded her from prying questions. She replayed the small moment when he covered her trembling hand with his own, feeling again the surprising warmth of his reassurance. By the time she slipped into a comfortable dress and made her way to the kitchen, she'd resolved to approach the rest of her contract with more calm. If Salem was willing to maintain this respectful distance, she could find a path through the complexities of his world. The kitchen itself had become a safe haven, a bright, modern space where Lane or one of the chefs always seemed ready with a kind word. Lane, cheerful as ever, greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a breakfast spread of fruit, eggs, and pastries. As she settled at the counter, Audrey checked her phone for messages from home. Her father's condition had been stable lately, thanks to the treatments made possible by Salem's payment. Her brother, too, seemed optimistic about continuing his education without the constant threat of looming bills. Their most recent texts were tinged with relief, and a wave of gratitude that made Audrey's eyes sting with unexpected emotion. This was why she'd signed that piece of paper, and it reaffirmed her willingness to see the contract through. Before she could dwell too long on her own feelings, Noah appeared in the doorway with his ever-present tablet. He inquired if she had a moment to discuss a few upcoming engagements. With an apologetic glance at Lane, Audrey finished off her tea and followed him into the corridor, where they ended up near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. "Last night went smoothly," Noah said, tapping a note into his device. "Mr. Blackwood was pleased with your composure. He wants you to join him for 2 more events this week, a private dinner with some potential partners and a small charity luncheon." He paused, scanning the lines on the screen. "Also, he asked me to see if you needed anything, clothes, personal items, or time off for any personal errands." The polite inquiry caught her off guard. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, grappling with the realization that she hadn't even left the penthouse on her own since moving in. "I might need a few more of my belongings," she admitted. "I only brought the bare essentials, and I didn't expect the schedule to be quite so formal." She thought, too, of how she longed for small touches of normalcy, her favorite books, perhaps some family photos. If possible, I'd like to visit my apartment to collect a few things. Noah nodded, already planning logistics. That should be no trouble. I'll arrange for one of the drivers to take you this afternoon, if you're free. She felt a ripple of relief, grateful for a chance to regain a sense of her old life, even if only for an hour. Thank you, that means a lot, she said softly, remembering to offer him a smile. She'd found Noah to be both efficient and unexpectedly compassionate, a grounding presence in a world where extravagance often overshadowed human warmth. A few minutes later, Audrey made her way through the penthouse to the small reading room she had discovered earlier, hoping to find a moment of quiet. To her surprise, she found the door slightly ajar. Inside, a voice, Salem's, echoed softly. She paused in the hallway, debating whether to knock or back away. Before she could decide, his tone grew sharper, and she realized he was on a phone call. She didn't intend to eavesdrop, but curiosity rooted her in place. She caught fragments of his conversation, a deal going south, a competitor undercutting him. The tension in his voice climbed, laced with frustration and a hint of anger. Even from the hallway, she could tell the conversation was personal in a way no business matter should be. Something about a broken trust, a partner's betrayal. An unsteady pang of sympathy stirred in Audrey. She recalled the fleeting vulnerability she'd glimpsed in Salem's eyes. Could it be that beneath the polished exterior and vast fortune, he grappled with the same kinds of betrayals that haunted less privileged lives? The idea brought a bittersweet sense of connection. Yet she also felt the weight of her own position. She was here by contractual obligation, not genuine choice. Did that make her another transaction in his already complicated existence? With a twinge of guilt, she decided it was best not to linger. She moved back a few steps, then cleared her throat loudly before stepping up to the doorway. Salem fell silent, abruptly ending the call. When she pushed the door open, she found him standing with his phone in hand, shoulders taut. "Apologies," she said quietly, attempting to keep her voice steady. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just looking for a place to read." For a moment, he regarded her with a closed-off expression, as though assessing how much she might have overheard. Then the tension in his posture eased a fraction. "No need to apologize," he replied, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I was nearly finished." Awkwardness stretched between them. Audrey couldn't ignore the subtle shadows beneath his eyes, the suggestion of a man carrying more burdens than he revealed to the world. The memory of last night's gentle reassurance, his hand over hers, nudged her to speak. "If you need the room," she offered softly, "I can come back later." He shook his head. "It's all right. I was about to step out anyway." She nodded, casting her gaze around the cozy library-like space. As he passed her, heading toward the door, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. Then his voice dropped to a quieter register. "I understand you'll be going to your apartment this afternoon. If there's anything else you require, furniture, decor, feel free to bring it here." The hint of generosity touched her, so she met his gaze, surprised. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." He gave a curt inclination of his head, as though dismissing any further gratitude. Then he strode out of the room, leaving the door ajar behind him. For a few seconds, Audrey remained standing there, her mind swirling with half-formed thoughts. Clearly, Salem had his own struggles, ones that went far beyond simply managing an empire. The revelation filled her with a cautious empathy she hadn't expected to feel so soon. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the back seat of one of Salem's sleek, chauffeured cars, gazing out the tinted window as the city blurred by. She directed the driver toward her modest apartment complex, a far cry from the marble and glass grandeur of the penthouse. When they arrived, she stepped onto the familiar curb with a rush of conflicting emotions, relief at being on familiar ground, but also a pang of self-consciousness, knowing the contrast between these two worlds was stark. Inside her small apartment, she gathered a few items that felt like pieces of her real self, a stack of favorite novels, a handful of framed photos, and some cozy sweaters she missed wearing. Her eyes lingered on a photo of her father and brother, taken years before her father's health declined. She traced the edge of the frame, recalling simpler times. It struck her how abruptly she'd left home, thrusting herself into a contract for their sakes. She tried not to dwell on whether she had chosen the best path or simply the only one she could see. Unexpectedly, her phone buzzed. She answered, expecting perhaps a courtesy call from Noah or Lane. Instead, it was her brother, his voice brimming with cautious optimism as he reported good grades and the beginnings of a scholarship search. He asked if she was all right, insisting she could talk to him if she ever felt overwhelmed. The tenderness in his words nearly broke her composure. She reassured him she was safe and well, leaving out the details of her lavish yet uneasy existence. By the time she ended the call and packed up her belongings, the sun had begun its descent, casting the narrow hallway in golden light. The chauffeur waited patiently outside, and she felt a pang as she locked the apartment door. Her real life, her old life, waited behind it like a closed chapter, one she could only peek into now and then. Even so, she pressed forward. Returning to the penthouse with these fragments of normalcy might remind her of the person she was, despite the glittering cage in which she now lived. The drive back took longer than expected due to rush hour traffic, giving her too much time to think. She turned over every detail of her conversation with Salem, the overheard tension in his voice. The man who'd rescued her from debt, albeit for his own reasons, clearly had unresolved battles of his own. Audrey wondered how deeply her presence complicated those battles, if at all. Was she merely another puzzle piece in his high-stakes life, a status symbol meant to mask deeper conflicts? As she stepped once more into the penthouse, balancing a small box of her belongings in her arms, Noah greeted her at the elevator. He offered to carry the box to her suite, which she accepted, grateful for the kindness. She recognized that same undercurrent of discreet empathy in his expression, perhaps he sensed her feelings of displacement. For the rest of the evening, Audrey busied herself arranging her books on a shelf in her bedroom, placing family photos on a small table near the window. Each small addition turned the space from a pristine showpiece into something resembling a home. The transformation gave her a fleeting sense of relief, a reminder that she was still allowed some measure of autonomy here. Yet beneath it all, she couldn't shake the realization that her contract remained in effect, binding her to Salem's schedule, his needs, his public image. The few glimpses she'd caught of his guarded vulnerabilities only sharpened her own confusion about their arrangement. All she could do, she decided, was stay true to herself, even if that meant navigating a narrow path between compliance and self-preservation. When she finally slipped into bed, surrounded by the comfort of her own pillows and the echo of distant city lights, her thoughts drifted to the conversation she had overheard. Perhaps tomorrow she would see more of Salem's world, his power struggles, his hidden frustrations, and in turn, he would glimpse more of her own truths. With that tentative hope, Audrey closed her eyes and tried to rest, uncertain whether her empathy for him was a blessing or a dangerous invitation to care more than her contract ever intended. Audrey woke the next morning to a sense of restlessness, as though a subtle current of tension rippled through the penthouse. She tried to shake it off, telling herself she was reading too much into the silence. After all, Salem wasn't always present, he traveled often, handled back-to-back meetings, and sometimes returned so late she'd never catch more than a glimpse. Yet something felt different now, an undercurrent of unease that made her pulse quicken as she dressed in a simple blouse and skirt. She found her way to the kitchen, where she hoped to encounter the comforting routine of Lane or the quiet bustle of staff preparing breakfast. But the space was oddly empty. A single note on the marble countertop read, "In meetings all day. Help yourself." It was signed with Salem's initials, SB, yet the letters looked hastily scrawled, as if he'd dashed them off while rushing out the door. She set the note aside and poured herself a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the faint twist of disappointment in her gut at his abrupt departure. Noah appeared shortly after, stepping softly into the kitchen and offering a polite greeting. He carried his tablet as usual, but his expression was subdued. Audrey couldn't help but notice the faint shadows beneath his eyes, much like those she'd glimpsed on Salem before. Something was amiss. "Is everything okay?" she ventured, sipping her coffee. Noah hesitated, fingers curling around the edge of his tablet. "Mr. Blackwood's been under a lot of pressure," he admitted. "A major deal he's pursuing is in jeopardy, and, well, it's causing some internal conflicts at the office. He had to leave early to handle a crisis meeting." Audrey nodded, recalling how she'd overheard hints of a betrayal during Salem's phone call in the library. She wondered if the same crisis now loomed larger, threatening to unbalance him. "I see," she said quietly. "I hope it resolves soon." She expected Noah to pivot to standard business, an upcoming event, a reminder about her schedule, but instead he let out a long breath. "It might get worse before it gets better," he said, lowering his voice. "I only mention it because you may notice him more on edge. When personal matters intersect with business, it's never simple. And with Mr. Blackwood, he doesn't always show how close he is to the breaking point." Audrey's pulse fluttered. "Thanks for telling me," she managed. She realized that if even Noah was concerned, the situation must be dire. Though she had no direct stake in Salem's company politics, she felt an involuntary tug of sympathy. Beneath his chilly reserve, he was a man with vulnerabilities, no matter how well he tried to mask them. She considered retreating to her suite to spend the day reading or rearranging the few personal items she'd brought from home. But a restlessness gnawed at her. This was more than just fulfilling a contract. She wanted to understand what was happening. Against her own caution, she asked, "Is there anything I can do?" Noah blinked, looking surprised by her offer. "It's not really my place to involve you in the company's complexities," he replied gently. "But, if you're inclined to help, perhaps you could keep an eye on Mr. Blackwood's mood, for lack of a better term. He might not admit he needs support, but if the tension keeps building, there's a risk he'll do something rash." The suggestion startled her. Since when did a contract companion become an emotional stabilizer? Still, she felt a flicker of resolve. "I can try," she said. "I don't know how much influence I really have, but I'll be there if he needs to talk." Noah gave a small, relieved nod. That might be enough. They parted ways, and Audrey spent the morning organizing the reading room. With Salem preoccupied, she needed an outlet, something to ground her. She arranged books on the shelves by genre, business and finance on one side, literature and history on the other, trying to restore order to a space that felt overshadowed by the memory of his tense phone call. Outside, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it did little to dispel the subtle knot of worry in her stomach. By midday, she resolved to check on the staff, learning from Lane that the entire penthouse had been in a hush since Salem's abrupt departure. Lane shrugged when asked if she knew what was happening, offering only that urgent business matters had come to a head. The rest of the staff responded with similar vagueness, and Audrey felt a wave of frustration, not at them, but at the isolation swirling around Salem's predicament. That evening, the penthouse remained unusually quiet. Audrey picked at a light supper alone, her mind drifting to her father's health updates. His recent tests looked stable, and that small victory gave her comfort. It reminded her why she was here in the first place, to protect her family, to pay off their crushing debts. A wave of guilt washed over her for even thinking about Salem's troubles when her own motives were so entangled. Still, she couldn't deny that living in his orbit, seeing glimpses of his hidden struggles, had begun to stir a deeper sense of concern. The hours slipped by, and Salem did not return. Around 11, she paced near the large windows, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkness. She tried distracting herself by reading a novel she brought from her old apartment, but the words blurred, and she found herself listening for the sound of footsteps or the soft whir of the private elevator. Midnight came and went with no sign of him. She had just decided to retire for the night when her phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar, possibly one of Salem's lines, but she answered with a hushed, uncertain hello. A crisp voice, male and commanding, flooded her ear. "Ms. Selwyn. This is Graham Steele, head of corporate security at Blackwood International." A pause, heavy with significance. "I apologize for the late hour. I'm calling because Mr. Blackwood specifically requested I reach you. There's been an incident at the office." Adrenaline surged through Audrey's veins. She gripped the phone tighter. "Is he all right?" Another tense pause. "He's unharmed physically. But we need you to come down to the main building. Mr. Blackwood insists on it." The unspoken urgency in Graham's tone made her heart pound. "I'll send a car right away." Her mind whirled with questions, but Graham ended the call before she could press further. She stared at her phone, gut twisting. Why would Salem demand her presence in what sounded like a crisis? From everything she knew, his company's headquarters were practically a fortress of formality. She could only assume something had gone horribly wrong, enough for him to break the usual boundaries of their arrangement. Within 20 minutes, Audrey stepped into a black SUV that arrived at the penthouse entrance. The driver, stoic and uninformative, whisked her through the nearly deserted city streets, lit by the occasional glow of a street lamp. Her mind conjured worst-case scenarios, a hostile takeover, or maybe a leaked scandal that threatened to tear down Salem's carefully curated public image. She feared the latter, given her role in his life. Could her presence at the office be related to the contract she'd signed? When she arrived at Blackwood International, a glass and steel monolith glimmering in the dark, Graham Steele greeted her in the lobby. He was tall, with short-cropped silver hair, and moved with the measured precision of someone who'd served in the military. "Ms. Selwyn, this way," he said, guiding her toward a private elevator bank. No explanation, no small talk. The building felt eerie at this hour, lights dimmed, halls quiet. They ascended to one of the top floors, emerging into a sleek executive suite. The atmosphere was fraught with tension. A handful of staff milled about, their faces etched with worry. Beyond them, Audrey spotted Salem pacing in front of a wall of windows, a phone pressed to his ear. Even from a distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the glint of controlled anger in his eyes. Graham hovered by her side. "He asked for you specifically," the head of security repeated, voice gentling. "I'll leave you to talk, but I'll be outside if you need anything." She steeled herself, crossing the open expanse of polished floor until she stood a few feet away from Salem. He didn't notice her at first, too absorbed in his phone conversation, which seemed to center on contracts, missed deadlines, and some deal put in jeopardy by an anonymous sabotage. At one point, he stabbed a finger toward the window as though the person on the other end could see his frustration. Eventually, he hurled a curt goodbye and ended the call with a furious tap. The tension in the air was palpable. He turned abruptly, and for a moment, his expression was so dark she almost stepped back. But then he recognized her, and a flicker of relief crossed his face, so quick she might have missed it if she weren't watching closely. "Thank you for coming," he said tersely, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket. His voice held a brittleness she'd never heard before, as though he were close to snapping. She swallowed, unsettled by the unguarded emotion in his eyes. "What happened?" He glanced away, jaw clenched. "Sabotage. Documents were leaked to a competitor, details that undercut months of negotiations. The entire deal is hanging by a thread." A scoffing laugh escaped him, bitter, hollow. "I trusted someone who turned out to be working against me." All at once, she understood the weight that had been pressing down on him lately, the suspicious phone calls, the urgent meetings. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, wanting to reach out but unsure if her comfort would be welcome. "But, why did you want me here?" For a moment, the facade he'd worn so expertly cracked. Pain and fury mingled in his expression, brightening his eyes to a sharper hue. He turned back to the window, staring down at the city lights. "Because I needed to speak to you before this escalates any further," he said at last, his voice low. "There's a chance this leak isn't just about business. It could be personal, and if it is, our contract might be exposed. Which means you could become a pawn in all of this." Audrey's pulse thundered. She recalled the clause in her agreement about strict confidentiality. If that confidentiality were breached, it could destroy Salem's reputation, and hers. Worse yet, it might jeopardize the fragile salvation she'd found for her father's medical care. Her voice wobbled. "So, you think someone could use the details of our arrangement to hurt you?" His shoulders tensed. "Yes," he admitted, his tone clipped. "I brought you here tonight because if this escalates, I want to make sure you're prepared. We might have to issue statements, or maintain a tighter security detail around you. In the worst-case scenario, I may need to sever your public connection to me entirely, to protect you from further scrutiny." She stared at him, unsettled by the grim determination in his eyes. "Sever my connection? But the contract, my father's medical bills, my brother's tuition. He cut her off with a raised hand, not out of rudeness but urgency. "None of that changes," he said. "I'll honor my commitment, no matter what. But we may have to pretend we don't know each other, if the press or our enemies start circling. This leak might be the first shot in a bigger war." A wave of dizziness hit her. She pressed her palm to her forehead, trying to collect herself. I understand," she whispered. "I'll do whatever is necessary." Salem let out a slow breath, as though grappling with the burdens of both his empire and his promise to her. His gaze flicked to the dim reflection of their forms in the glass. "I never wanted you involved in my corporate battles," he murmured, almost to himself. "But it seems I can't separate them anymore." She took a step closer, compelled by the quiet despair beneath his words. "I'm here," she said gently, her own voice trembling. "For as long as this contract stands, and, if it's okay to say, maybe even beyond that." Surprise flared in his eyes, as though the notion of genuine support stunned him. In the hush of the executive suite, they stood locked in a moment of shared vulnerability. The tension from his phone calls, the anger at betrayal, all of it swirled around them. Yet in that moment, Audrey glimpsed a man caught between his obligations and his longing for real connection, and she realized with startling clarity that she wanted to help him carry the weight. He drew a breath, the harshness in his features softening ever so slightly. "Thank you," he said, a note of sincerity coloring his usually brisk tone. That means more than you know." Before she could respond, Graham Steele reappeared, clearing his throat from across the room. "Sir, we've just received another update, there's a new lead on who leaked the documents." Salem pulled his gaze from Audrey, returning to the here and now with a steeled expression. "I need to handle this," he said, stepping away. She watched him stride toward Graham, the conversation drifting into hushed tones of urgency. Her heart pounded from the intensity of it all. This was no simple contract, it was a collision of lives, secrets, and desires. For better or worse, she had stepped into Salem's private battlefield. And judging by the fire in his eyes, the conflict was far from over. As the night wore on, staff hurried in and out of offices, phone calls were made, and documents were scrutinized. Audrey stayed near, occasionally receiving a nod from Salem that told her he appreciated her presence. She answered none of the staff's inquisitive glances, offering only tight smiles to those who recognized her from the penthouse. A swirl of uneasy anticipation filled her belly. Whatever battles Salem fought now, she had become part of the front line. When dawn broke, painting the sky with faint streaks of pink, Salem finally paused, looking exhausted and furious and relieved all at once. He signaled for Audrey to join him. The office lights glowed harshly against the backdrop of the awakening city. "I'm taking you back to the penthouse," he said in a low voice. "I'll be behind you shortly, once I coordinate with legal counsel." Don't speak to the press if they approach. Remain behind closed doors until I figure this out. She nodded, her eyes stinging with tiredness. Okay. Be careful. For a fleeting instant, his gaze roamed her face as though memorizing it. Then he turned away, back to the swirl of crisis. Unsure how else to respond, she left with Graham, numb and tense, carrying the weight of Salem's unspoken burdens in her heart. She understood now that their arrangement, once a mere business deal, had transformed into something far more dangerous and deeply personal. And despite her best efforts to remain detached, she realized she was already too invested to walk away unscathed. Audrey spent the remainder of the morning in a daze, pacing the penthouse's silent corridors while the city outside stirred to life. She'd barely caught more than a few hours of fitful rest, haunted by the tension she'd seen in Salem's eyes and the dire implications of a leaked contract. Every creak or distant footstep set her nerves on edge, as though reporters or corporate agents might burst in at any moment, demanding answers she wasn't prepared to give. Eventually, she dozed off on one of the plush living room couches, only to be startled awake when the private elevator chimed. Groggy and heart-pounding, she sat upright, half expecting Graham Steele to reappear with dire news. Instead, it was Salem himself, stepping out with shoulders slumped and tie askew. The overhead lights caught the exhaustion in his face, and an unguarded flicker of relief lit his features when he found her waiting. "Hey," she whispered, her voice rough with sleep. She stood, smoothing down her rumpled blouse. "Are you all right? Did anything else happen?" He dropped his jacket on the back of a chair and sank into it, running both hands through his hair. She'd rarely seen him so visibly drained, like a man who'd marched across a battlefield. "There was more fallout," he admitted. "We confirmed the source of the leak and confronted them. But the damage is done. Some of my partners are threatening to pull out of a major investment unless I salvage our reputation within the week." She felt a pang of sympathy so strong it made her chest ache. "I'm sorry," she said softly. She edged closer, unsure if he welcomed her company. "Is there anything I can do?" For a moment, Salem regarded her with that same searching gaze she'd glimpsed in his office. The tension in the lines of his jaw gentled, and he let out a weary sigh. "I doubt it," he replied, though not dismissively. "But, thanks for asking." Audrey hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the couch next to him, mindful of giving him space. She could sense the fragile bond they were forging in this crucible of crisis. Perhaps it was the exhaustion or the lonely quiet of the penthouse, but she felt a sudden surge of courage. Placing a tentative hand on his forearm, she asked, "Tell me what happened. Who did this?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as though summoning the words. "A former ally," he said bitterly. "Someone I trusted with sensitive information. I suspected they were angling for a bigger slice of the pie, but I never thought they'd stoop to sabotaging my deals." He exhaled, dropping his gaze to the polished floor. "They sold the intel to a competitor, hoping to force me into a weaker negotiating position. And, apparently, they have enough unscrupulous connections to threaten exposing personal matters." Audrey's mind jumped to their own arrangement, the contract that could destroy his carefully curated image if revealed. "Our contract," she breathed, heart hammering. "So they might use me as leverage." His eyes flicked up, dark with warning. "They could. That's why Graham insisted on security measures. If word of our deal comes out, it might push away investors who don't like the optics. Or worse, the media could swarm you, dig into your personal life. You're vulnerable because of me." Swallowing hard, Audrey felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of her bristled at the idea of being labeled vulnerable, but she knew he was right. She had no armor against the tabloids or business sharks if they decided to circle. "I'm not giving up my end of the agreement," she said firmly, more certain than she expected. "I've come too far to back out. But, how can we keep this from spiraling?" Salem studied her for a moment longer, as though measuring her resolve. I've got my legal team and PR specialists working on it. They're spinning this crisis as a minor breach of corporate confidentiality, nothing more. We're hoping to plug every leak before any tabloid gets wind of our arrangement. She nodded, her palm still on his forearm. Something about his ragged breathing and disheveled appearance emboldened her, made her want to be more than just a contract companion. Is there a plan if it does go public? A humorless laugh escaped him. Damage control, mostly. We'd issue statements that you're just a friend or an associate. But rumors would swirl. I won't lie, it would be ugly. His voice dropped to a murmur. And I hate that you'd be dragged into it. Her chest tightened. She gently squeezed his forearm, offering what little reassurance she could. We'll face it, she said. If it happens, we'll handle it together. I'm not going to vanish just because it gets complicated. The conviction in her words seemed to unsettle him. He turned his head, gazing out the towering windows at the city skyline bathed in early morning light. You shouldn't have to deal with my mess, he muttered. I brought you into this world because I thought I had control over it. But it's becoming clear how fragile that control is. Before she could formulate a response, the elevator chimed again. Noah's voice echoed in the corridor, calling Salem's name with an urgency that made both of them rise to their feet. They exchanged a quick, uncertain glance, and Salem shrugged back into his discarded jacket. Noah's expression was grim as he rounded the corner. Sir, we have a development. One of your shareholders caught wind of the sabotage and wants an emergency conference call. Now. He glanced at Auditory, offering a polite but worried nod. Also, we've got a reporter sniffing around the building, asking questions about you and Ms. Selwyn. Security escorted them away, but it may not be the last attempt. Auditory's heart lurched. It was starting, the creeping intrusion of public scrutiny. She recalled Salem's warning that the press might target her if the rumor mill picked up on her sudden appearance in his life. Fine, Salem said, tugging at his tie to straighten it. Set up the call in my study. Auditory, you, he broke off, blinking uncertainly at her. For a moment, it seemed like he was torn between telling her to stay put or follow him. She braced herself for him to cast her aside, to shield her from the fray. But instead, he let out a sigh. You might as well come along, he said, voice low. They might ask about you indirectly, and I'd rather you hear it firsthand than from rumors. It was a statement that carried more weight than the words suggested, an invitation into his professional battlefield. Auditory nodded, pulse racing. I'm with you. Noah led them to the study, a wood-paneled room with a massive mahogany desk and large windows overlooking the city. On a side table, a sleek computer screen had been set up for the conference call. Within moments, they were connected to a voice-only session. Auditory stood off to the side, arms folded protectively, while Salem took a seat behind the desk. One by one, senior shareholders introduced themselves, each more agitated than the last. They wanted answers. Why had the sabotage happened, who was responsible, and how was Blackwood International preventing further leaks? Salem responded in a measured tone, explaining the immediate steps taken by corporate security and legal counsel. Auditory couldn't help admiring how he held his composure, despite the tension practically radiating off him. But then the conversation took a turn. A gruff voice, belonging to a particularly influential shareholder named Magnus Vale, cut through the others. Word on the street is that some personal matter connected to you, Mr. Blackwood, might have contributed to this fiasco. Something about a private arrangement with a companion. Care to enlighten us? Auditory's heart thumped so hard she feared it would echo across the line. She cast a quick look at Salem, whose expression hardened like steel. His eyes flicked briefly to her, a silent apology in them, then back to the screen. That's baseless speculation, Salem said, each word clipped. My personal life is not a factor here. The sabotage stemmed from corporate espionage, pure and simple. Vale gave a skeptical grunt. Be that as it may, this personal life is the subject of quite a few rumors. Investors don't like secrets, Mr. Blackwood. If we find you've compromised the company's reputation or finances through your associations, we'll demand accountability. Audrey felt her cheeks burn. Her fists clenched at her sides. Though Vale hadn't used her name, the implication was clear. The idea that they could brand her as a liability, a scandal, stung more than she cared to admit. Salem's jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened against the edge of the desk. "I've done nothing that endangers this company," he replied, voice as cold as a blade. "I suggest we focus on the genuine threat, the corporate leak. That's where your concern should lie." A tense silence followed. Eventually, a different shareholder muttered about waiting for results of the investigation. Vale grumbled something inaudible and disconnected. The rest of the line fizzled out, leaving Salem seething in the study's heavy silence. Noah cleared his throat delicately. "We'll continue damage control, sir," he said, then stepped out to manage the next steps. Audrey approached the desk, heart still pounding. She placed a hand on the back of the chair, as if to anchor them both. "That was brutal," she whispered. Salem exhaled shakily. "They smell blood. If they believe I'm distracted or compromised by personal matters, they'll move to push me out of my own company." He pressed his palms against his temples, massaging the tension. "I worked my entire life for this. Built everything from the ground up, only to have it jeopardized by betrayal and rumors." A pang of empathy flared in Audrey's chest. Without thinking, she reached out, letting her fingertips graze his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is unfair to you, and it's unfair that you have to defend me in front of them. I feel like I'm adding to your burden." He looked up, and something in his expression cracked. For a fleeting moment, Audrey saw not the aloof billionaire but a man teetering on the brink of despair. "You're not a burden," he said, voice low and rough. "If anything, I appreciate having someone here who's not just angling for power or money." Her heart clenched. "But I came into your life because of a contract," she reminded him quietly. "It's hardly." He cut her off by rising from the chair, moving so close she could feel the faint heat rolling off him. "Yes, the contract," he said, almost bitterly. "I arranged it for my own reasons, none of which included letting you see me like this, weak, uncertain. But you're here anyway, and I can't pretend I'm not grateful for it." The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. Audrey's throat grew tight. She wanted to wrap her arms around him, to offer solace, but the logic that had governed their arrangement warned her to keep her distance. "I'm glad you feel that way," she managed, her voice trembling. "I just wish we weren't in the middle of a corporate war." A humorless smile tugged at his lips. "You and me both." He took a measured breath, some of the tension ebbing from his posture. "Go back to the penthouse for now. Let me handle the next wave of chaos. If anything else arises, I'll send for you." Though the word stung, returning her to that role of waiting on standby, she understood he was trying to shield her. She forced a small nod, stepping back. "Okay. But, if you need anything, I'm here." Salem watched her with an intensity that prickled along her skin. For a moment, she thought he might close the distance, breach the invisible boundary between them. But the tension of the day intervened. He simply nodded and turned away, phone already vibrating in his pocket. Feeling a swirl of longing and worry, Audrey left the study. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway, her thoughts racing. She knew this was more than a simple business fix. Salem was fighting to keep his empire intact, and her own fate was now tied to his in ways she hadn't predicted. The contract that once defined their relationship no longer felt like the real barrier between them. Now, it was the threat of exposure, the judgment of shareholders, and the ghosts of betrayal that kept them apart. By the time she returned to the penthouse, she felt both relieved to escape the corporate battlefield and strangely bereft, knowing Salem still struggled alone in that high-stakes arena. She sank onto a sofa and stared out at the skyline. Despite everything, she couldn't deny the truth any longer, she was growing attached to him. Not just the provider who paid her family's debts, but the complicated man behind the polished facade, the one she'd glimpsed struggling with wounded pride and unexpected vulnerability. In the hush of the penthouse, she whispered a silent vow to herself: no matter how this ended, whether it went public or stayed in the shadows, she would stand by him. She didn't know if it was love, not yet, but it was stronger than any clause in their agreement. And if the coming storm revealed their secrets to the world, she wanted to be sure she had no regrets about where she stood when the dust settled. Daylight bled into dusk with a swiftness that left Audrey feeling disoriented, as though the city had fast-forwarded while she was lost in her own thoughts. All day, she'd hovered in a state of restless anticipation, answering occasional texts from Noah but otherwise waiting for news from Salem. Though her rational mind told her there was little she could do to alter the course of his high-stakes battles, her heart refused to calm. Every hour that ticked by without seeing him felt like another reminder of just how tangled their lives had become. Around 6 in the evening, she received a terse message on her phone: dinner at 8. Don't leave the penthouse. Signed simply, SB. It offered no explanation, no mention of the crisis still unfolding, yet the command was clear. She stared at the screen, trying to interpret whether the invitation was a gesture of connection or just another protective directive. Ultimately, she found herself combing through her closet for a dress that felt both comfortable and presentable, choosing a midnight blue wrap that struck a balance between casual and refined. When the time came, Audrey made her way to the penthouse's private dining room. She expected to find staff bustling about, but the space was startlingly quiet. The long table, which could easily seat 10, had been set for 2 near its center. A single vase with white lilies stood in the middle, and beside it, flickering candles cast dancing shadows across the polished surface. The effect was intimate, far more so than any setting she'd yet encountered in Salem's domain. Her pulse quickened. What reason could he have for organizing such a private dinner when the company's fate hung in the balance? Moments later, she heard the click of the door and turned to see Salem entering. He looked composed, his suit immaculate, yet she could sense the tension thrumming beneath his polite smile. Dark circles hollowed the skin beneath his eyes, as though he hadn't slept since the night's turmoil. Still, he nodded in greeting, gesturing for her to sit. "I'm sorry for summoning you so abruptly," he said, taking the seat opposite hers. The candlelight illuminated the sharp angles of his face, making him appear both elegant and haunted. "I've been in meetings all day, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I needed a break." She placed her hands in her lap, struggling to contain her relief at seeing him. "You must be exhausted," she said softly. "Have there been any improvements?" He shook his head. "Not yet." Without elaborating, he signaled to a waiting staff member at the room's periphery. 2 covered dishes appeared, each artfully arranged with roasted vegetables and tender cuts of meat. "I asked for something simple," he explained, giving her a one-half smile. "It's been a day of chaos, and I thought we could at least have a quiet meal." Audrey watched him carefully. The same man who had commanded entire boardrooms now looked like he was barely holding himself together. She felt a surge of protectiveness, wanting to ease the burden he carried, even if only by listening. "Thank you," she managed, her voice catching slightly. "It smells wonderful." They began eating in a silence punctuated by subdued clinks of silverware. Despite the tension in the air, the food was delicious, reminding Audrey of how little she'd eaten all day. She dared not talk about shareholders or leaked documents, afraid to ignite the stress lurking beneath Salem's calm facade. Instead, she let him steer the conversation, a small mercy she hoped he'd appreciate. After a few minutes, he broke the quiet. "I keep thinking about what Vale said," he murmured, referring to the gruff shareholder from the conference call. "How they're convinced there's some personal scandal overshadowing my business. It's ironic, I tried to keep my private life locked up, only to have it become the focal point of this entire fiasco. Audrey set her fork down, the appetite draining from her. You did what you felt you had to, she said gently. And I agreed, because, well, I needed the help. Neither of us expected it to blow up like this. Hesitating, she added, I'm sorry if I've complicated things for you. If I had known. He waved her apology aside. We both had our reasons, he said. And none of this is your fault. The only ones to blame are those who broke my trust and sold out the company. His gaze flickered to her, lingering. Still, I can't ignore the fact that if rumors about us intensify, the board will push even harder. They'll claim I'm distracted, unfit to lead. And if that happens, you'll lose everything you built, she finished for him, her voice trembling with empathy. She couldn't bear the thought of Salem being ousted from the empire he'd created, not after seeing how deeply he cared about it. I wish I could fix it somehow. You and me both, he said, lifting his wineglass to take a small sip. After a beat, he set it down and cleared his throat. Noah suggested a short trip out of town, maybe tomorrow, to throw off any reporters who might be sniffing around. A day or two of staying out of the public eye while the legal team finalizes their investigation. It might buy us time to manage the fallout. She tilted her head, curious. That's a good idea. But, would you go, too? A bitter laugh escaped him. If I leave now, they'll think I'm running. And with the board so jumpy, I might not have a company to come back to. He pressed his lips into a tight line. Which means I'd prefer you to go on your own. Just until things settle. A pang of disappointment and concern struck her in equal measure. The thought of walking away, even briefly, felt wrong. Yet her rational mind recognized the logic. If she wasn't in the city, the press couldn't corner her for a tell-all interview. But leaving Salem alone in the midst of this battle made her chest clench with worry. I'll go if that's what you need, she said quietly. But I don't like the idea of hiding while you face everything alone. He studied her across the flickering candles, something unreadable in his eyes. I don't like it either, he admitted. But I won't risk you being dragged into this nightmare. For a moment, his voice softened. You've already endured more than I ever intended when I first struck that deal with you. Audrey mustered a small, wry smile. We've both gone further than we expected, I think. The conversation lulled again, leaving space for them to finish their meals. When the plates were cleared, Salem gestured for the staff to leave the room, granting them a rare moment of privacy. A hush settled, broken only by the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. She could feel his gaze on her, could practically sense the questions he might be too proud or cautious to voice. Thank you for being here, he said at last, his tone low and uneven. I know this was never just about companionship for you. You needed my help, and he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I needed to control an aspect of my personal life for once. But it's turned into something else, hasn't it? Her heart hammered. She thought back to the times she'd caught glimpses of his pain, the gentle way he'd touched her hand when she was frightened, the quiet vulnerability he'd shown in his office. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think it has. He reached across the table, hesitating an inch away from her fingers, giving her the choice to close the distance or not. Without hesitation, she let her hand meet his, warmth flooding her at the contact. For a moment, the swirl of corporate wars and media threats faded into the background. All that mattered was the unspoken confession in their locked gaze, a fragile admission that they were no longer merely two people bound by a contract. I can't promise what tomorrow will bring, Salem continued, voice hushed yet fervent. This crisis could destroy my standing, or maybe we'll navigate it. Either way, he faltered, his composure warring with whatever he longed to say. She squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to promise anything. I'm not here for guarantees. A flicker of relief crossed his face. He turned his palm to cradle her hand more fully, the gesture carrying a surprising intimacy. If you leave for a few days, we can keep you out of the tabloids. But I'd rather not push you away more than necessary. His gaze searched hers. Are you sure you'd go willingly? Even if it means we won't see each other for a while. She swallowed, throat suddenly tight. The thought of leaving him alone felt like an ache she couldn't name. But she also couldn't let her own emotions cause him more trouble. If it's the best way to protect you, and us, then yes, I'll do it. It won't be forever. He nodded, gratitude mingling with regret in his expression. I don't deserve your loyalty, he said quietly. But I'm grateful for it nonetheless. A twinge of frustration rose in her chest, though she kept her voice calm. Loyalty isn't something you deserve or don't deserve. It's something freely given. He looked as though he might say more, but the chime of his phone shattered the moment. Letting go of her hand, he fished the device from his jacket pocket, glancing at the screen with a darkening expression. I have to take this, he muttered, pressing a button and raising the phone to his ear. Yes. A pause. Fine. I'll be right there. When he ended the call, he closed his eyes for a heartbeat, as though gathering the strength to leave her again. The board members want an unscheduled meeting tonight, he said, resigned. They're afraid I'm letting this crisis get out of hand. Audrey pushed to her feet, aware that whatever fragile closeness they'd found had to yield to the demands of his empire. Go, she encouraged, attempting a reassuring smile. I'll be here when you return. He stood as well, hesitating by her side. For the first time since they'd met, he leaned in and brushed a light, fleeting kiss against her forehead, neither quite familial nor wholly romantic, but charged with the promise of deeper emotion. It stole her breath and caused her to blink in surprise. Before she could process it, he stepped back, the stoic CEO returning to the forefront. Thank you, he murmured. I won't be long. And then he was gone, disappearing into the corridor like a phantom in a dream. Audrey stood there, heart thundering, fingers brushing the spot where his lips had touched. In the quiet aftermath, she realized just how much the tide had turned. Their contract still existed, but it no longer governed what she felt. She wanted to stand beside him not because she owed him, but because something much more complicated, tenderness, attraction, perhaps the beginnings of genuine love, had taken root in her chest. After a few moments, she padded out to the living room, staring at the city lights flickering in the distance. The weight of Salem's battles still loomed, but tonight, for the first time, she sensed hope that there could be a future in which their relationship, born from desperation and secrecy, might transform into a genuine bond. Of course, that future depended on navigating the gauntlet of corporate betrayals and media scrutiny, an ordeal that could undo everything they'd built. Yet as she settled onto the couch, a small, determined flame burned within her. She would go into hiding if that was what it took to protect them from scandal. She'd endure the whispers, the judgment, even the risk of losing the small corner of independence she'd carved out. Because standing by Salem felt right, no matter how precarious the circumstances. And in a world where trust was a precious commodity, she wanted to prove that someone could stand by him for reasons other than money or power. Glancing at the clock, she wondered how long his meeting with the board would last, and whether he'd return in the dead of night, drained and weary. She resolved to wait, even if it meant dozing off on this very couch, prepared to welcome him back with the reassurance he seemed to crave more than he'd ever admit. With every tick of time, she understood more deeply that, for better or worse, they were in this together now, two souls unexpectedly bound by a contract that had opened the door to something far more enduring than either of them had planned. Night in the penthouse brought an unfamiliar hush, as though the very walls held their breath for what was about to unfold. Audrey remained curled on the living room couch, stubbornly resisting the lure of her bed in hopes Salem would return soon. She flicked off the overhead lights, allowing the city's soft glow to light her surroundings. The clock above the fireplace ticked ominously, marking every minute that he was gone. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to sleep. If this was the last night before she had to leave, for her own protection, as Salem insisted, then she wanted to see him one more time, to give him one more reassurance that he wasn't alone in the battle. It was well past midnight when she finally heard the private elevator whir to life. Her heart seized with both relief and trepidation. She stood, smoothing out the creases in her dress, trying to compose herself even though her pulse thundered. When the doors slid open, Salem stepped out, shoulders heavy with fatigue. A muscle in his jaw tightened at the sight of her, and for a split second, she feared he'd scold her for waiting up. Instead, he crossed the floor in purposeful strides until he stood mere inches away. "You're still awake," he murmured, voice low and raw from what must have been hours of debate with the board. "I wanted to see you," she admitted, searching his expression. Dark shadows ringed his eyes, and worry lines bracketed his mouth. Even so, he radiated a resolve that hadn't been there before, an almost defiant steadiness. He exhaled, weariness and gratitude mingling in his eyes. "We had the meeting," he said tersely. "The board demanded a timeline for plugging the leaks and mending investor relations. They want significant proof of my focus on the company's well-being. If I don't deliver results within the next 2 weeks, they'll move for a vote of no confidence." A cold dread sank into Audrey's stomach. "So it's worse than before," she deduced. "They're essentially giving you an ultimatum: fix everything, or they strip you of the power to run your own empire." He nodded. "Exactly." His gaze flicked to the window, where city lights formed a glittering tapestry. "I can't let them see me falter. But with each passing day, rumors grow about my private life, our contract. If it leaks, I'll be painted as reckless, morally compromised. It'd be the final blow." She pressed her lips together, remembering the plan for her to slip away temporarily. "Then I should leave," she said quietly, ignoring the ache in her chest. "Give them one less angle to exploit." Salem's eyes returned to hers, the turmoil within him unmasked. "That's what we decided," he said, voice raspy. "But the thought of sending you away, it gnaws at me." Audrey swallowed, torn between the wish to stay and the knowledge that her presence might add fuel to an already raging fire. "I don't want to go," she confessed, stepping closer, "but I'll do it if it keeps you safe." "Keeps your company safe." He let out a ragged breath. Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hands to her shoulders, a gesture that felt strangely intimate for two people whose relationship had begun as a transaction. She could feel the tension in his fingertips, the conflict roiling beneath his polished exterior. "What if there's another way?" he asked, scarcely above a whisper. A rush of hope and confusion twisted in her. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, releasing her shoulders to rake a hand through his dark hair. "You told me before that you're willing to face whatever comes, but I couldn't bring myself to ask more of you. To risk your reputation and privacy, all because I made a flawed choice about how to handle my personal affairs." She looked at him steadily, her pulse humming with concern. "I won't pretend this situation is simple," she said. "But you're not forcing me anymore. I'm staying because I choose to." A small, tremulous smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that spoke more of relief than joy. "If the media or shareholders learn about our contract, we can't hide behind half-truths. It'll blow up in our faces. But," he continued, voice firming with a daring edge, "if we get ahead of them, if we turn this narrative into something that isn't a scandal, maybe we can strip the leaks of their power." She blinked, realizing what he was hinting at. "Are you talking about a public statement? Admitting our arrangement?" He grimaced, as if even saying it tasted bitter. "Something like that," he allowed. "Though not exactly an admission of a contract. We could frame it as a relationship." The final word lingered between them like an unspoken secret. Audrey's heart pounded. She thought of all the times she'd asked herself if there was something more than obligation driving them to care for each other. Now, with the entire world potentially poised to judge, Salem was proposing to transform their hidden dealings into a public story of romance, or at least partnership. It would create a storm, she said, her throat tight. People would speculate, dig into our pasts, question the timing. But maybe they'd stop calling you reckless if it looked like an honest bond rather than a bought secret. He nodded once, the seriousness in his gaze unshakable. I know it's a lot to ask. And if you say no, you can vanish for a while and stay out of the crosshairs. I'll handle the fallout alone. She could feel her heart hammering in her ribs, a chorus of doubts and desires competing for her attention. Under normal circumstances, she might have balked at the idea, pretending a full-blown romantic relationship to appease corporate wolves and tabloid hounds. Yet the look on Salem's face, the raw honesty she'd seen in his battles, told her that maybe, just maybe, this was the only path forward. I don't want to leave you to face them all alone, she admitted, voice trembling with resolve. I never did. He closed the space between them. Then we stand together, he said, his tone quietly fierce. No more secrets. If the board or the press want a story, we give them one that shows I'm not distracted, I'm committed. And you're not just some hidden affair, you're, he paused, searching her eyes as if afraid to voice the thought. Audrey's heart swelled with a tender ache. She laid her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath. I'm what? She prompted gently, her gaze unwavering. His hand rose to cover hers, capturing it against his chest. You're the woman who helped me see beyond my own ambition, he said, quietly yet firmly. I never expected to feel this way about you, not when I first put that contract in motion. But now, here we are. And if I have to declare my intentions publicly, let it be the truth. Emotion surged in her chest. She knew better than to ask for flowery confessions or long-term promises in the heat of crisis. Yet hearing him speak so candidly of his shifting feelings was enough to send tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. I want this, she whispered, half in disbelief. I want to stand by you, not as a contract partner but as someone who genuinely cares. A tremor coursed through him, and for the briefest moment, Audrey saw a raw vulnerability in Salem's eyes. Then he dipped his head, pressing his forehead lightly against hers. The intimacy of the gesture left no space for doubt, they were choosing each other, even amid the potential ruin. All right, he breathed, letting his hand slip around her waist. We'll do this carefully. I'll talk to my team in the morning, figure out a statement or a controlled interview where we present a united front. I won't lie about how we met, but I'll keep the damning details buried. We'll emphasize what matters, that we're together. It's going to be a spectacle, but it might save my company, and maybe us, too. She inhaled shakily, the magnitude of his plan sinking in. It won't be easy, she warned. People might call me a gold digger or claim you're trying to distract from the sabotage. We'll be under a microscope. His lips curved into a faint, resolute smile. Then we'll show them that we're more than a transaction. We'll show them that we're partners, not a scandal. Before she could reply, he leaned down and captured her lips in a soft, tentative kiss, one that was neither purely passionate nor merely polite, but an honest, trembling bridge between two hearts that had spent too long guarded by contracts and caution. She breathed him in, the taste of wine and sleepless nights still lingering on his breath. For a moment, the rest of the world faded, the press, the board, the looming deadlines and betrayals. All that remained was the promise of something real. When they finally broke apart, Audrey felt lightheaded, a medley of relief and anticipation swirling in her veins. Salem rested his forehead against hers again, chest heaving. We're taking a huge risk, he murmured. If the board sees this as a publicity stunt, they could turn on me faster than ever. But if we do nothing, I'll lose my company anyway. I can't stand the thought of losing you, too. She brushed a trembling hand along his cheek, marveling at how a man once so distant and impervious could reveal such raw emotion. We'll fight together, she said, letting her voice carry the conviction she felt. Come what may. He drew her into his arms then, holding her as if she were both a shield and a lifeline in a raging storm. She clung back, every doubt overshadowed by the strength of their decision. The city lights shimmered beyond the window, silently bearing witness to their vow. Eventually, Salem escorted her to the couch, pulling her down beside him. The tension that had haunted the penthouse for days seemed to melt, replaced by a fragile, comforting stillness. For the first time in weeks, Audrey felt no compulsion to keep her distance or frame her words in deference to the contract. Instead, they spoke quietly of the practical steps ahead, coordinating with PR, preparing for a press conference, possibly even staging a public appearance to legitimize their story. Yet beneath all the planning, a new current ran strong, the knowledge that this was no mere performance for the cameras. Yes, they were orchestrating it to protect Salem's empire and her privacy, but the feelings fueling their decision were undeniably real. By choosing the public path, they would lay claim to each other in a way neither had anticipated when they first signed their names on that fateful agreement. As the hours crept toward dawn, exhaustion caught up with them. Salem's eyelids grew heavy, and Audrey urged him to get some semblance of rest. They ended up dozing side by side on the long couch, his arm draped over her shoulder, her head resting on his chest. Even in their sleep, their fingers remained intertwined, an unspoken promise that they'd wake to face the world as a single unit, no matter how vicious the scrutiny. Sunlight found them still tangled in each other's warmth, stirring only when the penthouse staff discreetly notified them it was time for the morning routine. Salem rose first, pressing a gentle kiss to Audrey's forehead, and she clung to his hand a moment longer before letting him go. Neither said the words, "goodbye," for they both knew what came next was a collective "we," the final step to sealing this new path they had chosen together. Before stepping away to prepare, Salem caught her gaze, an unspoken question hovering in his eyes: "Are we really doing this?" She answered him with a soft, unwavering nod. "Yes. We are." And so, on that bright morning in a city that never truly slept, two hearts forged an alliance stronger than any contract or cunning sabotage. Their story had begun as a business deal in the shadows, but it would emerge into the daylight as a testament to resilience and, just maybe, the start of a love neither had known they were capable of.